Annapurna is supposed to be a mountain, a challenge to overcome, a summit to conquer. But for those who dare its slopes, it becomes a patient executioner that kills slowly, methodically, and without mercy. Since 1950, this single peak has claimed 73 lives out of just 365 successful summits, a death rate of nearly 20%, making it the deadliest mountain on Earth. From the legendary alpinist who survived 5 days paralyzed in a tent at 24,000 feet, his teammates injecting him with steroids as he slowly faded in their arms, to the world-class explorer whose final radio transmission was cut short by the sound of house-sized ice blocks cascading down upon him, to the anesthesiologist who was declared dead and abandoned, only to be found 2 days later waving weakly at a rescue helicopter before dying in a hospital bed. But first, the Spanish climber who suffered a massive stroke in the death zone and spent his final 120 hours conscious, trapped, and slowly dying, while the world's best mountaineers raced against time to save him. These weren't quick deaths from avalanches or sudden falls. They were prolonged agonies where hope and despair battled for days, where survival became a form of torture, and where the mountain's cruelty revealed itself in the most disturbing ways imaginable. On May the 23rd, 2008, at 7,400 meters on Annapurna's south face, Spanish alpinist Iñaki Ochoa de Olza suffered a catastrophic stroke. At 47 years old, Iñaki was a veteran of 14 8,000 peaks, but nothing could prepare him for what would follow. As temperatures plunged to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit and winds gusted to 60 miles per hour, his small tent at Camp 4 transformed into both a makeshift medical facility and his death chamber. The stroke immediately paralyzed the left side of Iñaki's body and triggered severe pulmonary edema. Yet cruelly, he remained conscious, unable to speak clearly or move as his lungs slowly filled with fluid. Within hours, an unprecedented international rescue operation mobilized. Legendary climbers Welly Steck, Simon Moro, and Denis Urubko abandoned their own expeditions and raced toward Annapurna to save one of their own. Medical supplies were airdropped, including dexamethasone steroids and oxygen, offering a fragile thread of hope. On day 1, the first rescuers reached Iñaki's camp and began administering steroids and oxygen therapy. For the next 48 hours, they attempted the impossible, trying to drag his paralyzed body down vertical ice walls using improvised pulley systems. By day 4, it became clear that his medical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and extraction was simply impossible at that altitude. On the 5th day, after 120 hours of conscious suffering, Iñaki died in the arms of his rescuers, who had become both his caregivers and witnesses to his prolonged agony. His body was left at Camp 4, as extraction conditions made recovery impossible. The rescue team emerged traumatized after watching a helpless man die slowly over 5 days despite their heroic efforts. The international climbing community began questioning the ethics of prolonged rescue attempts that might extend suffering without offering real hope of survival. Today, Iñaki's tent remains a permanent memorial at 7,400 meters, a reminder of how death zone medical emergencies become extended torture sessions, where consciousness during the dying process multiplies the psychological horror, and where even the world's best rescuers stand powerless against the mountain's patient cruelty. On October 18, 2011, South Korean explorer Park Young-seok was attempting a new route on the south face of Annapurna. Park was no ordinary climber. He was the first person to complete the true explorer's Grand Slam, having summited all 14 8,000-meter peaks, reached both poles and climbed the 7 summits. With him were experienced alpinists Shin Dong-min and Kang Ki-seok. Their final radio contact came from 6,300 meters as they traversed an active rockfall zone. The south face of Annapurna has long been known as cursed. Multiple expeditions had vanished there without a trace. Park's team was climbing an unestablished route through an unstable serac zone, regularly updating base camp until their 2:47 p.m. transmission. Weather conditions were deteriorating, with increased rockfall activity shaking the mountain face. Park's final radio message still haunts the climbing world. "We are falling rocks. Rocks are falling everywhere." The transmission cut to static mid-sentence and was never resumed. A massive rockfall event buried the entire section of their route under tons of debris, obliterating any trace of the climbers. Search teams deployed immediately but found nothing. No equipment, no camp remnants, no bodies. December 25th, 1997. On the north face of Annapurna, Kazakhstani legend Anatoly Bukrev was attempting a winter ascent with Italian climber Simone Moro and Russian cinematographer Dmitry Sobolev. Bukrev was considered mountaineering royalty, the hero of the 1996 Everest disaster who had saved multiple lives through superhuman efforts. That Christmas Day, a massive cornice collapse would trigger an avalanche that would test even his legendary abilities. The cornice collapse triggered a waterfall of massive ice chunks that swept down the face with devastating force. Moro was knocked unconscious, his body torn open and thrown nearly 1,000 feet down the mountain. Bukrev and Sobolev were instantly buried under tons of ice debris, vanishing in seconds. When Moro regained consciousness, he found himself alone, screaming for partners who had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Moro's desperate search through the avalanche debris found nothing: no equipment, no blood, no signs of his friends. Years later, Sobolev's body was discovered still seated upright, encased in ice like a frozen museum exhibit. But Bukrev, the man who had defied death on nearly every major mountain on Earth, was never found despite extensive searches and recovery attempts. The hero of Everest had become a permanent part of Annapurna's ice. The mountain had shown no respect for heroic reputations or past survival feats. This instant erasure of a climbing legend proved somehow more disturbing than a prolonged death: avalanche violence beyond human comprehension or survival, where even the strongest are rendered insignificant in seconds. Three different forms of horror: the conscious 5-day death watch, the instant erasure of legends, and the cruel vanishing of voices mid-sentence. But Annapurna's cruelty reaches its peak when it offers false hope, when rescue becomes possible, but survival becomes impossible. The mountain's most disturbing trick may be letting victims live just long enough to suffer more. May 20th, 2019. At 7,500 meters on the descent from Annapurna's summit, Malaysian anesthesiologist Wee Kin Chin collapsed from exhaustion. At 48 years old, Chin was an experienced high-altitude climber, but his Sherpa guide, Nima Chering, now faced an impossible choice as their oxygen supplies dwindled and a weather window was rapidly closing with an approaching storm system. Chin had summited successfully but collapsed during the descent. His guide's oxygen supply was critically low, and he could not carry an unconscious client down the technical sections that lay ahead. The devastating decision was made to abandon Chin and descend to save the guide's life. Expedition leaders declared Chin missing and presumed dead, another victim of the mountain's unforgiving calculus. Day 1. Chin was left unconscious at 7,500 meters without oxygen or supplies, exposed to temperatures that fell far below zero. Day 2. A helicopter search spotted unexpected movement and discovered Chin waving weakly at rescuers. It was a miraculous find. He had somehow survived 2 nights in the death zone without life support, defying all medical understanding. The zombie rescue, a man thought dead found alive against all odds, became international news. Chin was evacuated to a Singapore hospital in critical condition, but the damage had been done. 5 days later, he died from severe frostbite, multiple organ failure, and irreversible brain damage. What initially seemed like a miracle became a prolonged death sentence. Controversy erupted over the abandonment decision and delayed rescue response, with the climbing community divided over whether the false hope of survival had merely multiplied suffering for both the victim and his family. The mountain had revealed its cruelest trick, offering rescue that leads only to slower death. Survival in the death zone often proves a worse fate than quick death, where false hope extends agony rather than providing relief. The cyclone brought a sudden temperature drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit with zero visibility. Trekkers were scattered across the exposed pass with minimal shelter when guides, facing their own mortality, abandoned clients to save themselves in the whiteout conditions. The blizzard dumped meters of snow in hours, trapping separate groups across the mountainside. What followed revealed the darkest aspects of human survival instinct. Survivors began using frozen corpses as windbreaks to survive the night. People froze to death while standing upright in walking positions, their bodies becoming human statues in the snow. When rescue teams finally arrived, they found bodies arranged as human walls against the wind, the dead becoming final shelters for the living. The mass casualty recovery operation took weeks in harsh conditions. Survivor testimony revealed horrific details of using the dead as shelter, actions that would haunt them long after their physical recovery. An international investigation into guide abandonment and weather forecasting failures followed, and the popular trekking route gained a new reputation as a potential death trap for the unprepared. The mountain had turned tourists into survival cannibals, using human remains for protection. The mass death event revealed how quickly civilization's veneer can crack in extreme conditions, and how popular routes offer no protection against nature's sudden violence. October the 17th, 1992. On the south face of Annapurna, French alpinists Pierre Béguin and Jean-Christophe Lafaille were attempting a new route on the notorious Death Wall. A single anchor failure at 7,000 meters triggered a catastrophic fall that would force Lafaille to witness something no climber should ever see: his partner disappearing into the void along with all their ropes and climbing gear. Béguin fell thousands of feet, taking essential equipment with him and leaving Lafaille stranded alone on a vertical wall with no descent gear. Lafaille now faced the impossible. He would need to downclimb 7,000 feet of technical terrain without ropes. During the second day of his descent, falling rock broke Lafaille's arm, adding physical agony to his psychological trauma. For the next 5 days, Lafaille performed what many consider the most extraordinary feat of survival in mountaineering history. Days 1 and 2. He began the impossible downclimb with a broken arm, using his body as a counterweight against the vertical rock. Days 3 and 4. Hallucinations from exhaustion and trauma began, with Lafaille later reporting conversations with his dead partner guiding him down. Day 5. He reached base camp after 5 days of one-handed climbing in a state of complete psychological breakdown from witnessing his partner's death and enduring the survival ordeal alone. Lafaille required months of physical and psychological rehabilitation. His story became legendary in climbing circles, but he remained haunted by his partner's death. He never fully recovered from the trauma of watching his friend vanish into the abyss. His survival became a lifelong burden rather than a triumph, with nightmares and flashbacks continuing until his own disappearance on Makalu 13 years later. The mountain had demonstrated how witnessing a partner's death multiplies survival trauma, how impossible descents become psychological torture sessions, and how the mountain forces survivors to carry the guilt of living when others die. Annapurna doesn't just kill, it orchestrates elaborate psychological horror shows where death becomes a performance and survival becomes torture. From Inyaki's 5-day conscious dying to Chin's false resurrection, from Park's instant erasure to Lafaille's nightmare descent, this mountain has perfected the art of human suffering. It offers hope only to snatch it away, grants rescue only to extend agony, and turns survival into a burden heavier than death. These weren't mountaineering accidents or natural disasters. They were demonstrations of nature's capacity for cruelty, where the mountain revealed its true character, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a patient predator that feeds on human hope and turns every victory into eventual defeat. Which of these disturbing deaths affected you most? The prolonged agony or the instant erasure? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to understand more about how mountains can torture rather than simply kill, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Final Moments. Next time we examine the psychology of cave diving deaths, where the exit is always visible but never reachable. Until then, remember that some mountains don't just test your limits, they break them slowly, deliberately, and without mercy.